The drone holds station at 1,200 meters above a concrete flight line somewhere deep inside Russia. For a fraction of a second, the onboard camera resolves a shape in the revetment below: a swept wing, a long fuselage, 8 turboprop nacelles. The operator locks on, the frame tilts downward, and the footage cuts out. That clip, released by Ukraine's security service on the 1st of June 2025, was the opening image of a verification problem that would occupy satellite analysts, open source researchers, and Western intelligence assessors for the next 96 hours. The strike itself was spectacular. The count, what actually burned, what was merely struck, what was already inoperable, and what Russia quietly replaced before the next satellite pass, that was something else entirely. That is what this episode is about. Operation Spiderweb was not the largest Ukrainian strike of the war, but it was almost certainly the deepest in geographic terms and the most thoroughly documented in its aftermath. Within 4 days of the attack, a loose coalition of commercial satellite operators, volunteer imagery analysts, and intelligence officials had independently audited a strike that took place 4,300 kilometers from Ukraine's border, further than London is from Moscow, and arrived at a public record that in some ways was more precise than either government's official statements. That precedent matters long after the smoke cleared from the flight lines at Belaya and Olenia. Let us begin with what happened, by the account Zelensky himself gave publicly, and which SBU chief Vasyl Malyu confirmed in broad terms. Operation Spiderweb took 18 months and 9 days from the start of planning to execution. 117 FPV drones were smuggled into Russia in components, according to Ukrainian disclosures, and these details come from the SBU, so they should be understood as the Ukrainian side's own account. The drones were concealed inside trucks whose wooden cabin structures had been engineered with remotely opening roof panels, each truck reportedly carrying roughly 36 drones. The SBU said assembly took place in the Chelyabinsk area, which would place the launch points well inside Russian territory and within practical FPV range of bases across the Ural and Siberian regions. The targets were 5 air bases, each housing elements of Russia's long-range aviation, the Strategic Bomber Force, whose 295 MS Bear and 222 M3 backfire platforms had been launching cruise missile salvos against Ukrainian cities for 3 years. Belaya, in Irkutsk Oblast near Lake Baikal, was the farthest target, some 4,300 kilometers from Ukrainian-controlled territory. Olenia sat in the Murmansk region, Diaghilevo lay near Ryazan, Ivanovo-Severny near Ivanovo, and Ukrainka in Amur Oblast completed the list. 5 bases, 5 time zones, 1 night. The SBU released footage the same day. Analysts at the war zone and elsewhere began frame-by-frame geolocation almost immediately, matching revetment geometry, blast pen configurations and taxiway patterns in the drone footage against commercially available satellite imagery of the named bases. Drone footage is the first tool in the BDA toolkit. It provides an impact confirmation, a proof that the weapon reached the target area. It does not by itself tell you whether that something was destroyed, damaged, or merely scorched. It does not tell you whether the aircraft was operational or a parked derelict, and it cannot account for what happens to the airframe in the hours and days after the strike. That requires overhead imagery. The first overhead layer arrived the same day, from an unexpected direction, not an optical satellite waiting for a cloud-free window, but radar. ICUS operates a constellation of synthetic aperture radar satellites, SAR platforms, that build images from microwave pulse reflection rather than reflected sunlight. SAR sees through cloud cover. SAR works at night. On the 1st of June 2025, ICA SAR imagery indicated at least 4 Tu-95s, likely damaged or destroyed at Belaya. The analysts who published this included a crucial caveat. SAR resolution made it, in their words, difficult to definitively determine the state of aircraft. Bright radar returns where there should be smooth metal indicate structural disruption. Changed signatures indicate heat damage. But SAR cannot resolve whether the wing structure is gone or merely bent. SAR is the triage layer. It tells you something happened, approximately where, and that you should keep watching. The verdict requires optics. Over the following 3 days, as skies over Siberia and the Murmansk Peninsula cooperated, optical imagery from Maxar Technologies and Planet Labs arrived. Maxar's Worldview constellation can resolve objects smaller than 30 centimeters across. Planet Labs provided the temporal coverage necessary to catch changes between passes. What those optical images showed at Belaya was unambiguous. Maxar imagery revealed the burned remains of 3 Tu-25 MS strategic bombers and 4 Tu-22 M3 long-range bombers. The war zone noted that their positions on the flight line and inside blast pens suggested frontline, active aircraft rather than stored hulks. Hulks accumulate at the far edges of an airfield, off the active taxiways, with removed engines and stripped hatches. These aircraft were positioned as a unit positions aircraft it intends to use. That distinction matters when assessing the real operational impact of the strike. At Olenya, the picture was nearly as clear, though slightly more complicated. Burn marks indicated at least 5 destroyed aircraft, including at least 3 Tu-95 MS bombers. The wreckage of 2 was visible in available imagery. The third's remains appeared to have been removed by cleanup crews between the strike and the satellite pass. Also destroyed, what analysts assessed as an An-12 transport aircraft. The cleanup detail deserves attention. Russia did not leave the evidence in place, but that movement became evidence in its own right. If you can see that a wreck has been removed between one satellite pass and the next, you know the wreck existed. Even if the second pass shows only clean concrete. Then there was Olenya's more complicated problem. The war zone noted that one Tu-95 appearing seriously damaged in imagery from the 2nd of June looked, by the 4th, intact. The analyst's assessment was that Russia had most likely towed in a replacement airframe between the 2 satellite passes. The adversary being assessed is not passive. It reads the same commercial satellite scheduling data that analysts use to time their passes. It knows how frequently a given orbit revisits a given location. Counting is hard, not just because the instruments have limits, but because the subject is actively trying to frustrate the count. At Ivanovo-Severny, the situation was murkier. SBU drone footage showed what appeared to be an A-50 airborne early warning and control aircraft being struck. The A-50 is not a bomber. It is a flying radar platform, a force multiplier for Russian air operations. But satellite imagery of Ivanovo remained, in analysts' description, inconclusive. More tellingly, analysts noted that at least some of the airframes at Ivanovo showed missing engines in the drone footage itself, a detail suggesting stored or non-operational aircraft rather than ready platforms. At Diaghilevo and Ukrainka, available imagery showed limited confirmed damage. So now we have 3 layers of evidence: drone footage, SAR, and optical, and accounts substantially more precise than either government initially provided. But a 4th analytical process was running in parallel: independent OSINT cross-referencing. Researchers on the Telegram channel Okogora, the analyst known as @vivector, and others, cross-referencing Planet Labs and SAR imagery from the 2nd through 4th of June, arrived at a consolidated figure of 13 aircraft destroyed, 8 Tu-95 MS bombers, 4 Tu-22 M3 bombers, and 1 An-12 transport, across Belaya and Olenya. This figure was compiled and published by Militani. The war zone's more conservative reading of the same imagery landed at least 6 or 7 Tu-95 MS and 4 Tu-22 M3, roughly 10 to 11 confirmed. The honest answer, reflecting both analyses, is that independent researchers converged on somewhere between 10 and 13 aircraft destroyed. Now set those numbers against the claims. Ukraine's SBU stated that 41 military aircraft were hit, with at least 13 destroyed. The SBU also put the total damage figure at roughly $7 billion. The SBU's own estimate, never independently verified. The United States, per anonymous officials cited by multiple outlets, assessed approximately 20 aircraft hit, of which around 10 were destroyed. A NATO-attributed assessment, as reported by the War Zone, put the number completely destroyed at roughly 10 to 13. The spread, 41 hit, 20 hit, 13 hit, 10 to 13 destroyed, is not primarily a matter of anyone lying, it is a matter of definitions. Hit is not damaged. Damaged is not destroyed. Destroyed is not confirmed destroyed by satellite imagery. Those four categories occupy very different positions on the evidence ladder. When the SBU said 41 aircraft were hit, they were counting every aircraft against which an FPV achieved an impact, including aircraft that caught shrapnel through a thin aluminum skin but showed no thermal signature from space, including aircraft that were repaired within days, including possibly aircraft already non-operational. When imagery analysts said 10 to 13 were destroyed, they were counting only aircraft whose destruction was confirmed by visible physical evidence of burned or collapsed structure in high-resolution satellite imagery. The gap between those numbers is not propaganda, it is measurement. This is the forensic pitfall that the analysts published openly, and it deserves detail because it repeats in every major strike of this war. Shrapnel damage to thin-skinned aircraft, the aluminum honeycomb of a wing panel, the composite of a control surface, may be significant enough to ground an aircraft for weeks while leaving essentially no optical signature from space. A hole the size of a fist in a wing panel does not appear in a 30-centimeter resolution satellite image. So damaged is systematically undercounted in satellite BDA, which is partly why claim figures reliably exceed imagery-confirmed figures. The tire problem is more subtle and more interesting. Russia had taken to laying vehicle tires on the upper surfaces of parked aircraft, on wings, on engine nacelles, on fuselage sections, for both passive concealment and active deception. Tires are dark. Aircraft metal is reflective. In certain lighting conditions and at certain resolutions, a row of tires on a wing can look to an analyst not specifically watching for this, like a scorch or burn mark. Analysts working the Spiderweb imagery specifically flagged this pitfall, noting instances where apparent thermal evidence was, on closer examination, consistent with tire placement rather than fire damage. Some early counts may have included aircraft whose apparent damage signatures were Russian counter-drone camouflage, not strike effects. The analysts caught it themselves. It is a reminder that a BDA analyst is solving a puzzle the adversary has actively tried to make harder. The missing engines problem at Ivanovo is the third forensic pitfall. When SBU footage showed aircraft there being struck, the implication was that these were operational equivalents of the 295S and 222M3S at Belaya and Olenia, but at least some of the airframes had empty engine nacelles, a detail indicating aircraft stored for long-term parts harvesting, with engines removed and warehoused separately. Striking a de-engined airframe produces impressive footage and registers as a hit, but does not reduce the bomber fleet's operational capability. The distinction between operational and conservation aircraft at Ivanovo could not be resolved from available imagery, which is why the A-50 strike, despite compelling footage, was excluded from the confirmed destroyed count by the more conservative analysts. Taken together, these three pitfalls, shrapnel invisibility, tire camouflage, and the derelict versus operational ambiguity, explain almost exactly the gap between 41 and 13. They also explain why serious BDA takes days, not hours, and why any strike participant's initial claim should be understood as a preliminary report rather than a final assessment. Why did the targets matter? The Tuninta A5MS and 222M3 are products of Soviet industrial capacity that ceased to exist decades ago. Russia does not build new strategic bombers. The Tuninta A5MS production line produced its last airframe in 1992. The 222M3 line produced its last new-build example in 1993. Every strategic bomber in Russian service today is a finite Soviet inheritance maintainable only through cannibalization of other airframes and the exhausting of existing spares stocks. There are no replacement bombers in a factory waiting to fill the gaps. Each aircraft destroyed at Belaya and Olenia was, in the most literal sense, irreplaceable. These platforms were also the primary launch vehicles for Russia's Kur-101 and Kur-55 cruise missiles. A Tu-95 MS can carry 16 Kur-101S on rotary launchers, plus 4 more on wing pylons, the missiles that have struck Ukrainian cities, power stations, and apartment buildings for 3 years, reducing the available launcher count even by the confirmed 10 to 13 aircraft was not symbolic. The SBU claimed the operation disabled approximately 34% of Russia's strategic cruise missile carrier capacity, that is the SBU's own figure, to be treated as a claim rather than a verified assessment, but even at a fraction of that level, the operational effect was measurable. Russia's official response was notable primarily for what it omitted. Some attacks were acknowledged, some were attributed to repelled assaults, no loss figures were published. The satellite imagery filled the silence. The flight lines spoke where the press releases did not. The most telling evidence of Russian awareness of the overhead surveillance problem was the cleanup operation at Olenia and the possible airframe substitution the war zone analysts flagged. Russia was not trying to prevent the strike from being documented. It was trying to limit what the documentation could prove. That distinction says something about how both sides now understand the space-based environment they operate under. The verification timeline for this operation was approximately 96 hours from strike to reasonably settled public count. 96 hours is fast. The Falklands War took years to produce a definitive equipment loss accounting. Desert Storm's BDA famously overestimated Iraqi losses for months. The fact that 10 to 13 aircraft destroyed at bases 4,000 kilometers inside Russia could be independently verified within 4 days is a function of the commercial satellite ecosystem that has matured around this conflict. Maxar's Worldview Constellation, Planet Labs High Revisit Network, ISWI's SAR platforms. These are commercial services available on subscription to any organization that can pay for tasking. OSINT research groups like Okogora and individual analysts like Atta V-Vector operate without institutional affiliation, cross-referencing imagery that a decade ago would have been classified at a level preventing any independent audit. The democratization of satellite intelligence has not resolved all uncertainty. The Ivanovo debate and the tire versus scorch problem demonstrate that, but it has made it impossible to assert a number without that number being checked against what the orbit actually showed. The layered verification methodology that emerged from Spiderweb has become the standard against which every major strike in this conflict is now assessed. The first layer is released footage, drone cameras, any captured onboard imagery. It establishes impact and rough location, fast but shallow. It shows that something happened, not what the consequence was. The second layer is SAR, synthetic aperture radar, providing same-day, all-weather triage. It focuses optical tasking, flags structural anomalies, but cannot resolve individual aircraft damage definitively. The third layer is high-resolution optical, Maxar, Airbus, Planet Labs. The verdict layer, showing burned hulks and collapsed structures when conditions allow. The fourth layer is cross-analyst comparison, multiple independent researchers examining the same imagery and checking each other's work. The tire versus scorch pitfall was caught because multiple analysts were looking. The Olenia airframe substitution hypothesis emerged from comparing imagery across days. No single analyst or single satellite pass is sufficient. The process requires redundancy. The difference between 41 and 13 is the gap between what a strike participant knows from inside the operation and what external observers can prove from space. Both numbers are true within their own measurement framework. The contribution of the Spiderweb BDA effort was to make both frameworks visible simultaneously, so that audiences could apply the appropriate epistemic weight to each. The war has produced many dramatic footage releases. What it has also produced gradually is an analytical infrastructure for assessing those releases against physical reality. The Bellingcat chronolocation methods, using shadow angle, sun position, and known landmark dimensions to place a frame on a map, preceded Spiderweb by years. The Oryx visual confirmation methodology, logging only losses tied to a specific photo or video, has applied its standard to equipment losses since the first week of the invasion. What Spiderweb added was the large-scale application of multi-layer satellite BDA to a single closed operation, demonstrating that commercial imagery and volunteer analysis can, within a few days, produce an independently verified account of events at extreme geographic distance. The 295S and 222M3S at Belaya and Olenia were products of a Soviet industrial mobilization that cannot be replicated. Belaya sits near Irkutsk. Olenia sits above the Arctic Circle. Neither base had been a regular subject of public analysis before the commercial satellite era. Now both are indexed, revisited, and cross-referenced by people with no institutional affiliation and no security clearance, armed only with commercial imagery subscriptions and the discipline to look carefully. When a 295 burns on a flight line there, the world finds out within days. That is Operation Spiderweb's second legacy, less discussed than the strike itself. The bombers are gone. The methodology endures. The layered stack, footage, SAR, optical, cross-analyst audit, is now a template. The next time a strike produces competing claims thousands of kilometers from any conventional observer, the same process will run, the same pitfalls will need to be navigated, the same gap between hit and destroyed will need to be acknowledged, and the same commercial satellites, tasked by the same analysts working from open sources, will take their passes, deliver their imagery, and let the flight lines speak. Independent analysts converged on roughly 10 to 13 aircraft destroyed, against a Ukrainian claim of 41 hit, against a US official estimate of approximately 10 destroyed, against a NATO-attributed range of 10 to 13 completely destroyed. The numbers do not perfectly agree, but they agree far more than numbers verified from orbit in under 4 days have any right to, and none of them depend on trusting any government. They depend only on looking. In a conflict fought under near-permanent satellite surveillance, you cannot hide a burned bomber. The flight line said everything Russia chose not to say. The analysts wrote it down.